Hey guys, Private Jack here. And in this next couple of videos, what I'm going to be covering is QC eyes. QC eyes are those eyes that we can actually use flex controllers to move the iris and pupil around on a surface of an eyeball. Okay? So there isn't much out there on the web on this, and trying to read through the developer wiki, it just gets a little bit confusing, especially now with DMX versus SMD type files. And so I'm going to split this off into a couple of videos and maybe talk about what QCIs are, how they work, and that kind of thing in this video. And in the next video, we'll actually get down to actually finding out what the coordinates are that we require for the QC, and write a QC and get QCIs working on a model in Source FilmMaker. My videos are slow, they're long. Yes, I understand that. I try to bring new users along at the same pace so that at a pace that they can actually understand what's going on. So without further ado, let's get into this and talk about QCIs. So I've got a couple of Blender models here, and I've set them up so that I can emulate QCIs on the model in Blender. And the first one we're going to look at is this guy right here. Okay, so here I've got a character. I want the eyes to be able to work with QCIs. And so what do I actually have to do to set this thing up? Well, first off, what I've done is I've separated the eyeballs from the actual face, and I've taken it one step further in the fact that not only am I going to do 2 eyes here, I'm going to do 4. So, how do QCIs work? Well, first off, it's a combination of 2 textures, and these 2 textures are called by a material. The material that we're going to talk about in the videos is the eyes shader for valve models. There are 2 shaders that actually allow you to use QCIs. One is the eyes shader, which has been pushed off to the side in favor for the newer one called Irefrac. Now, I'm not going to get into Irefrac simply due to the fact that this is a basic VMT setup for the eyes shader, and this is the setup for the Irefrac. Okay, Irefrac requires an iris. The red, green, and blue channels of the iris do a certain thing, and then we can put noise on the alpha channel. We also require an ambient occlusion texture, and that is split up to RGB, and it doesn't use the alpha channel. Then we need an environmental map, and we need a cornea type texture where the red and green channels do one thing, of the texture do one thing, and the blue and the alpha channel have other data involved. Okay, this sets up the cornea bump. And then on top of that, we require a light warp type texture. And if any of these 4 types of textures are missing, then we end up with weird black and purple type tinting in the eyeball. So rather than get into that whole mess, I'm just going to let you guys explore that on your own. And I'm just going to talk about this simple eye shader, where all I require is a base texture for the whites of the eye and an iris. Okay, so now that we've got that down, let's find out how these things actually work. So, 2 textures are required in a material. Each eyeball must have its own material. So I'm going to select this eyes object that I have here. And here you can see I have 4 eyeball materials set up. I have one for the right, one for the left, one for the lower, and one for the upper eye. Okay, now the upper eye is currently black simply due to the fact that I'm going to show you how these things work. So basically what I have is the texture for the whites of the eye. And if I apply that to the model, it would look like this. Okay? Then on top of that texture, what I end up doing is I put a iris and pupil on it. And then what happens is we end up with something that looks like this. Now this iris is a separate texture. On top, it's overlaid on top of this eye's white texture. And what we're seeing is something that looks like this. Now, we can control this pupil and iris through vectoring. And I've set up a couple of drivers here on the XY vectors for the iris so that I can use this little cube to show you how this actually works now. So basically, if I grab this little cube now and I hit G to grab it and I start moving it to the left or to the right or up and down, we see that this iris texture is floating on top of the eye's white texture. And basically that's what's happening when we set up the QC eyes in Steam. What we have in the actual material is we have a base texture, which is the eye white texture, and we have an iris texture, which is the iris and the pupil texture. But this is not all that we require. Okay? If we want to set this thing up to actually work in Source Filmmaker with flex controllers, we have to set up the QC. Now the QC requires elements added to it. Okay? First off, we have to add attachments for each of the eyes, or for each eye that we're going to actually set up. We require a middle eyes attachment that is going to be the main focus of the controller. We have to set up a model statement for the object that has the eyeballs in it, because anything that has a flex controller you have to use a model statement. We have to set up the actual eyeballs themselves. Now this is just a 2 eyeball type QC. And then we have to set up the flex controllers. If the model has other flexes, like for the mouth and cheeks and that kind of thing, we also, if we were exporting SMD type files, we would have to set up the VTA. And that VTA is set up here in that model statement as well. So the eyeballs and any of the mesh that has flexes involved with it all have to be compressed into one mesh. So here is a typical SMD type QC. We've got the model name, we've got the model statement, and the scout reference is the item that contains all the flexes. We've set up the eyeballs. We've set up our flex file, the VTA, and we've defined all the flexes. We've defined the flex controller for the, let's see, that's lids closed. I'm looking for, okay. So we also have to set up the flex controllers for all the flexes that are in the VTA. And then finally, we have to set up the flex controller that controls the QC eyes. Then on top of that, we add variables and that kind of thing. And it just gets to be a big convoluted mess. And this is why people suffer so much when they export SMDs and expect flexes to work. Then in the QC, we've got the rest of the body groups, the LODs, yada, yada, the texture groups, body groups, that kind of thing. But there's also, if we come down here to the eyes, or the attachments, we also find that we have the attachments for both those left and right eyes. Each eyeball requires an attachment, and there has to be a centralized one for the actual flex controller. So that's what these are. And then yada 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 on down through the QC, the yada yada yada. A DMX type QC, however, we don't have to define the VTA file. Any of the facial flexes are automatically assigned to the mesh of the actual model. Okay? So we don't have to define those. However, we do have to define eyeballs. And we still have to use a model statement to do that. We have to define each eyeball. We have to define the flex controllers for those eyes. And we have to include our attachment statements. And then the rest of the QC is as per normal. Okay, so basically that's getting things in perspective as to how these QC eyes are working. And let me see, is this the one that I want? No, this is the one I want. So in this particular case, this is my QC for these 4 particular eyes. I've got attachment eyes. I've got an attachment statement for each of the eyeballs. Here's my model statement. I'm exporting DMXs, so if this model had other flexes, I would not have to define them. Here are my eyeball commands for each of the eyes. Here's my flex controller to control the eyes. And if I look at my materials, I have 4 separate materials, 1 for each eyeball. And then I don't have the actual VMT loaded up here, but that's beside the point. Now, for textures for this, when we set up our textures, we can have multiple textures we can have different textures for each eyeball. Or we can get away with just using one. It's all in a matter of how you set up your UVs. Okay? So in this particular case, what I'm going to do is I'm going to come into the edit mode, and I'm just going to select one of the eyeballs. And this is basically how that eyeball ends up being set up. So what I want to do is I want to have the texture, the UV unwrapped, and I want to have it set up in such a manner that the eye actually looks the way I want it to look in Source FilmMaker. And the best way to do that is have your 2 textures, but combine one into a single texture, and then set your UVs up against this texture. Now, if I go further and I select all the vertices here, you'll see that I have them all situated in such a way that they're displayed properly on the actual mesh. Again, this is only a single layer of mesh using 2 textures. Now, you say, okay, so you've got convex type objects there. What if I've got spheres or weird shaped eyes or that kind of thing? Well, it doesn't matter how these eyes look. If you set the actual textures up properly on the actual different objects, then the actual shape of the object doesn't really matter. And to prove that, let's go to camera number 2. So here are those 4 objects now using QC eyes, and as you can see, they're exactly the same as the ones that I have displayed here in Blender. So UV layout is an important factor of how the eyes are actually going to work. Like I say, I could have different textures for different eyes, but as long as the eye is displayed properly on the actual mesh before you do your export, you should be fine. Okay, so basically, and here just to demonstrate, I've got that cube still. I'm going to select that cube in object mode. I've got the driver set up. Now this one might work backwards because I haven't fixed up the variables right. But as you can see, those textures are floating over top of the iris and pupil texture is floating over top of the eye white texture. Okay, so that is setting up the model in Blender. Not quite, but now what we need to do is we need to determine variables for our actual QC. And basically, if we come back here into the QCI setup, what we need to do is we need to set up different aspects for the attachments, the attachment name for the eye, what bone is actually going to be driving that attachment, the attachment coordinates on the XYZ location, whether or not we want to rotate that attachment based on the bone or origin information on an XYZ plane, if we want that attachment to be a rigid attachment and throw away a bone, or if we want it in its absolute position. That goes for all the attachments that we create for our eyeballs. Then here in the model statement, the eyeball statement identifies the mesh as an eyeball. We have to tell the Studio MDL the name of the eyeball, what bone is controlling it, give it the XYZ coordinates with an offset on the whatever coordinate is required to pull the rotation point of that particular texture back into the head. We have to identify the eye white material. We have to tell what the diameter of the actual eye is. We have to set up what is known as a Walleye Effect. And basically what that is looking at the eye straight on. Nobody has eyes that are perfectly forward. Okay, they're offset a little bit towards the nose. That's the Walleye Effect. And then we are supposed to give it an iris material, but this particular variable is no longer used, but it still has to be in the statement. And then we have to determine what the actual iris diameter is on the model. Okay? We also have to determine what type of a factor we're going to use for the range of the actual flex controller. So, that is QC eyes pretty much in a nutshell, the technical aspect of it. So what we're going to do now is we're going to move on. We're not going to use this model because it's totally out to lunch. I helped a guy get a model into the workshop. And that model happens to be this one right here. GunchapRed and I sat down and we actually set up this model. However, when we set it up, we did not include QC eyes on this model. Okay? And basically, if I look at camera 3 now, this is that model in Source FilmMaker. Okay. If I come up here and I look at the model itself, and I go into it, I'm going to find that I don't have that face and eyes control group that we have in a model that has the QC eyes. Okay? Instead, this model is currently using bones to control the eyes. And this thing has a lot of bones. And trying to find the actual bone controls for the eyes, well, it can be deceiving. You sit here and look for it forever. Okay, so basically, let me get a hold of that model again. Come on, select it. Should be able to see the selection now. There they are. Okay, so this thing is using BIP eye left and BIP eye right as controllers for this particular, for the eyes. Get into rotation mode, set that to local. If I rotate these eyes now, what I'm going to find is that the textures move with the eye and the pupil. And that's simply due to the fact that because that these eyes are assigned to this texture. So I've got the pupil and the eye whites on the same texture. And that is not going to work with QC eyes. What I have to do is I have to separate the eyes white from the pupil and give the background of, or give the outside of the area of the pupil a transparent texture. So in the next video, what we're going to do is we are going to actually set up QC eyes here on Cynthia. And if you want to follow along, you can subscribe to this particular model on the Source Filmmaker Workshop. Going to say thanks to GunchapRed for letting me use the model in tutorials. I'm not going to upload the finished version because it's not my model and I'm not authorized to do so. But you will be able to download this, decompile it, follow the process, and then you'll have this model with QC eyes. So with that, I'm going to close off this particular portion of the video because it's getting long and I've gone through a lot of information for you to actually decipher, and create a new video on actually setting up the QC eyes for this model. So with that, I'm going to say Private Jack out.